What I want to look at in this podcast is the power that objects have. This is central to Miller's whole argument of stuff, but I think we tend to downplay it, or I think it's sort of almost seen as subliminal. And so we tend to think of objects in terms of um, their aesthetics or other aspects without really understanding the fact that objects are symbolic, and therefore the meaning is inherent in the object, but that very frequently you can't get the meaning from the object. There is no direct relationship between the two. I think it's easiest to see this when you're looking at objects from other cultures, from other systems, simply because the symbolism is missing. So, for example, going to stuff we talked about earlier, if you were to look at a Japanese, fairly traditional Japanese home, or even a fairly modern Japanese home, you will frequently find a niche set aside, and in that you might find a ukiyo print, or more likely you're going to find like an ikebana arrangement. But understanding what the actual flower arrangement is, in terms of what the symbolism is incredibly complex, and in many cases isn't really necessarily aesthetically attractive to an American concept of a flower arrangement. And that's because the arrangement of plant material is intentionally intended to set a set of symbolic messages to the viewer that, as with a lot of stuff we looked at earlier, is in a very calculated way, is designed to only be communicated to those that are sophisticated enough to appreciate it. And so it acts very much as sort of an intellectual quality control device, you might say. But in our own society, in our own culture, we don't tend to see objects that way. They work that way. They're very powerful in many ways. I would love to see someone do a dissertation on, for example, the American couch and what its symbolic, meaning is, because I think it's changed radically just in the last 20 years. But we don't tend to look at it that way. We tend to look at the aesthetics of it, or the cost of it, or the whether the texture and the color matches in the room. And we tend to, I think, almost miss the fact that the main reason you purchase those objects is because they're saying something. And so I think the easiest way for us to understand that in American society is actually go back in time. And so this is actually part of the work that I've done in the past as an archaeologist, when you're trying to reconstruct, for example, houses here, or house interiors and house furnishings that existed in, say, the 1860s or 1880s. It's very difficult to do because, the world that people live in, they don't think to describe. So if you think of the world that you live in, if you suddenly thought, okay, the room or the apartment or the house that I live in, do I have pictures of everything in there? And most importantly, can I explain why I have them? You'd probably fill up a book. And in most cases, we don't. People very rarely take pictures of the commonplace. And the only way you usually see it, if people are, in modern sense, if people are taking pictures or videos of people, and this is the stuff around or behind, sort of with the backdrop or the layout on which the things happen. But if you go back, even 50, 60 years ago, when people had film, film versus digital, pictures were much more expensive, and it was much harder to take a decent one. And so if you even go back, I would think right now, if you went back pre-TV, so for example, if you wanted to actually reconstruct an American house from 1942, say the start of World War II, I think you could have a really hard time. You'd be almost entirely dependent on things like catalogs, like Sears, advertisements in newspapers. And even then, that tells you what people were, what they were trying to get people to buy, but it doesn't tell you what people actually had in their house. And it doesn't tell you the stuff that had personal value or personal symbolism to them. So if you kick back to, say, I think I mentioned this before, you kick back to, for example, 1900, then you're in a world of hurt trying to figure out what actually existed in a quote normal, for example, Hawaiian, local house, say in Kaimuki in 1900, or say in 1920. Good luck. You're just not going to be able to find it. You can make guesses, but they're not going to be particularly accurate. So what that also tells us, though, is a lot of those things that existed in the past were symbolically important. And as our values and attitudes have changed, then you don't need those symbols anymore, which means you don't need the objects anymore because they don't have any symbolic component that's compelling to people. So let's take a look at some of these. I think it's probably going to take 2 videos to do, but we'll walk through a couple of these we've actually got. And you have to remember what we're talking about is oftentimes called the vernacular. We're not interested in what elites are up to. Elites are oftentimes dealing with other very complicated, very, in some cases, pretty strange agendas that we're not even interested in. What we are interested in, this is very typical of both American and European societies, is that in both Europe and in the United States, starting by the 1820s, 1830s, a large part of what people consumed is what you might call, extra money, basically, discretionary income was things that they purchased that make them look like they were socially upwardly mobile. So if you go to England, France, the United States in the 1830s, 1850s, 1860s, you'll see people very frequently buying plates, decorated plates, chinaware. It's oftentimes what it's called. In fact, they might have a chinaware set. They almost never used it. In some cases, never used it at all. But in their perception of the upper class in American and European societies, they always used chinaware. And so if you were middle class and you wanted to look like you were upwardly mobile, you would have pieces of chinaware, more decorated porcelains, simply because you wanted people that came into your house or saw your stuff to think that you were sort of in this house for a while, but you were moving up to someplace nicer. In other words, you were part of an upwardly mobile social group. And so what you get is this becomes a huge drive now, especially in the United States. And again, if you think of our Calvinist Puritans, that makes perfect sense. The whole drive there is improvement. And so this becomes one of the classic ways you see this. And I strongly recommend you take a look at one. I'm sure you can probably find them digitally. Would be the like Amy Vanderbilt and the other etiquette books of the period become bestsellers. And in fact, some of the, in the late 19th, early 20th century, I think 3 of the top 10 books in print that were purchased were etiquette books. And they weren't etiquette books just in terms of, how you talk to people or how you eat dinner or something like that. A lot of it had to do with what's in your house, how you presented the different rooms in your house, how you presented the objects in your house. And in many cases, actually told people what the objects meant. So what you were doing was actually socializing members of the society versus socializing someone from another society. And this becomes a hugely powerful thing because this is when you start to get the idea of what you might call consumer-based mass production. So you start to get people buying lots of furniture and buying lots of this and lots of that because they've been told and they've actually bought into the idea that having this stuff is important to project the image that you want others to see you with, versus, for example, those that know you by reputation. So etiquette books were hugely important as consumer drives in the very same way that social media is now. The influencers on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and all the rest of them are one of the major, if not the major force for purchases in the 2020s. And to a certain extent, the etiquette books were the the 19th century version of influencers. And so what you get is this drive as people start to get more discretionary income, as people's relative purchasing value starts to go up in the 19th century. Generally, people weren't buying bigger houses. If they were lower middle class, and in many cases they rented apartments or townhouses, flats they're called. But what they would do is they would increase both the amount of stuff in the flat, and they will also increase the quote quality, quote unquote, of the stuff in the flat. You can see this if you go one of the Sears and Montgomery Ward's catalogs from the late 19th, early 20th century, which there's been a ton of reprints. And if you're involved in interior design, I recommend that you get at least one of those. Just if that way, if you're ever having to look at, say sort of reconstruction or restoration of furniture and stuff from that period, you have some idea what you're looking at. Because invariably in Sears, for example, they would have, for example, 3 pairs of women's boots, and the women's boots would be good quality, better quality, and best quality. And so, and of course, then the price went up, and they were more elegant or more this or more that. And what Sears was doing was both mimicking the etiquette books, but also sort of driving the same thing through consumption, which is if you had just enough money to get a pair of boots, you got the cheap ones. If you had a little bit more money, you got the better ones. If you wanted to impress your neighbors, you got the best ones, even if you couldn't afford them. And this was the start of what we now see as normal consumerism. Of course, going with stuff we looked before, this would also explain the logic of malls. This is just sort of an extension of this. So let's take a look at the first one. Okay, the first one's called a hall stand. Let me segue out of the so you're not watching this. Okay, this is from Ames's books, which is the sort of the work on this. Hugely entertaining. I strongly recommend if you're interested in sort of what you might call social history of furniture. This is the book to look at. Here's an image of a hallway, a very typical sort of upper middle class hallway in the late 19th century in the U.S. So if you notice, by American standards, it's incredibly cluttered. It's also going to, of course, be incredibly dark. You have gas lamps maybe showing up. I think those look like gas lamps. But other than that, you have what we would now call kerosene lamps. Notice the prevalence of rugs, wood floors. You've got a large number of things on the walls. It's a very busy place. And you have to remember that this is the hallway. So if you go back to what we were talking about, I think a couple of podcasts earlier, the hallway was considered semi-public space. So even though this is inside the structure, it wasn't the private area of the family. The private area of the family would generally be around the corner behind a door, or maybe upstairs where maybe the sleeping area was, since this looks like a fairly small place. And so in that concept, the hallway was a place where public and private intermixed. Tradespeople dropping off milk or the mailman dropping off mail would come into this hallway. People who are here to visit might knock on the front door, but unless the front door were locked, and it usually wasn't, they would come into here and wait in the hallway and then announce their presence. And so the hallway was where people interfaced with each other. It's where the inside and the outside sort of merged. And this makes it very different than what you see in Asia, where the inside and the outside are usually defined by a very gated thing, both a door and then also that beam on the floor. And the inside and the outside are kept distinctly separate. There's no intermediate zone per se. In American society in the 19th century, there was a very large intermediate zone. It'd be sort of interesting today because I don't think we have intermediate zones anymore. But in the 19th century, this is what people had. And one of the main things that you're going to see in here is this. Okay, these are called hall stands. So these would be wood. These would be about, maybe a meter 60 high. They're strange looking. They're very, very heavy. They're almost invariably made of wood. They would have what looks sort of like a seat or something on a drawer that sticks out, but it's very narrow, and the drawer is very, very small. There was invariably a mirror, and then notice the very, sort of intense decoration taking place here. These were one of the 2 or 3 main objects you would find in a hallway. And these are one of the objects that have completely vanished from American life. I would suspect if you tried to find one online as an antique, it would cost you a fortune. I can almost guarantee there's no one that makes these today because they were all just discarded by the 1920s, 1930s. These are no longer relevant to American life. And so they just get tossed out. They're just, useless pieces of furniture that my grandpa liked, or something like that. They're very, very heavy. And so they're puzzles in the modern context, because if you actually look at them carefully, you realize there's not a lot of functionality going on here. They have these 2 sort of tray things on the side. And I'm just going to pause right now and just try to, without anything more, try to figure out what if you were looking at this from a functional standpoint, from the idea that furniture serves functional purpose. Here's a very expensive, relatively speaking, piece of furniture that was in this hallway, this intermediate zone between public and private. It was one of the main pieces of furniture you're going to see there. And trying to figure out, just from looking at this device, what its functions were and what its symbolic importance was. Okay, I'm going to assume that you did that. Now, if you look at these, what's really interesting about them is both they're very ornate, and they intentionally have very limited functionality. And this one, for example, if you tried to sit on this, sort of little built-in desk or whatever you want to table, I guess, for lack of a better term, you'd find that this is generally maybe about 30, 40, centimeters out. And if you sat on it, you'd literally fall off of it. It's not large enough to put your butt down on. And there's a little drawer in here, but the drawer is incredibly small and really doesn't go very deep. The only main part of this that's actually functional would be the mirror part. And even that's sort of interesting because for most folks, you're going to be sort of looking down into the mirror. It's not actually going to, your head's going to be up here. If you look at this mirror carefully, if someone's standing in front of it, the mirror shows your body to you basically from the neck down, not the head. The things on the side look like trays. They might also look like old style ashtrays. They're oftentimes pewter, but you'd realize very quickly that they're not intended, they're not removable, and they're not intended for cigarettes. So then the puzzle is, well, what do you have? They're not cup holders. What the hell are they? Why do you have a little desk/table built in that's not functional? This one here looks a little more functional too. You realize that if you try to sit down on this, you'd probably almost fall on the floor because it's so low. So again, it's larger, but it's not any more functional. In fact, the only major difference in the height would be the fact that this would probably be really good in the dark. This is a really good way to whack your knees as you're walking through the room, trying to figure out where you are. So again, you have these sort of strange devices on the side. Again, notice how again the mirror is actually too low to serve what in many cases a mod. It's not a full length mirror, but it's actually showing the body of the person looking in the mirror, not the sort of torso up part that you would think of it and say in a contemporary mirror today. So what were these? And it's the word itself sort of gives you a clue. Hall stands. And again, the main function of this is the hall stand was the one of two pieces of furniture whose function was to intermediate between the external and the internal, or the outside and the inside. The function from the inside going out was people from the inside leaving would check here before they left the front door of the house. In other words, went out of the hallway to the world to make sure that their clothing was appropriate, that they were tidy, put together, they had whatever clothes they're supposed to have, everything's ready to go. So again, as in the Asian concept, this idea that you're going into public performance space. So you're going on stage after you've gone past the hall stand. The other function it would serve is sometimes you'll see these over here. I think this is probably a leftover one. There was actually a side rack here, and this would be where we leave umbrellas. These devices here are sort of interesting because in many cases, one of these would actually have the cards that you carry when you leave. People invariably, when they went somewhere, took cards with them. The modern version of this would be a business card. But until the 1920s and 1930s, the majority of cards that people carried were actually their personal identification cards. They looked like business cards, but all they had was your name and stuff. And I'll show you those in a minute. And so you were supposed to you had these here so that you remember to take some with you in case you bumped into someone or whatever. So you had to have those. They were expected. The section here was set aside for purses, other objects, and hats, very commonly, that you would put down in here while you're checking yourself to make sure you're ready to go. And the drawer's function was to hold the cards. They were to hold your cards, spare ones or ones you weren't using. And also, oftentimes, to say the right-hand side, there'd be a little niche, and that was where you'd hold cards that people had given to you that for some reason you weren't that interested in having around. The left-hand side was for people to leave cards. So the right hand was for the owners of the place. That's their cards, their identity, cards. The left-hand side was intended for people that are coming into the house. Again, since this would be against the wall usually. And so what you would have is that would be where they would leave their cards if they came to see you and you either weren't there, whatever's. And so that's the function of this furniture. This furniture was basically sort of a combination of an answering machine, a mirror, a social check. In many ways, serves a lot of the functions that you guys do with your smartphones when you have the mirror function or other functions on, or even when you're doing a selfie, which might not be to actually take a selfie, but to check what you look like before someone else sees you. So that was one of the portions of the hall stand. Here's the other part of a hall stand. They're oftentimes next to each other, and this is a little more upscale. If you didn't want to just have the wooden mirrored object, what you would have next to would be this. And this is again one of those puzzles, because if you look at it, it's a little hard to figure out what it is. The closest thing that people usually guess, it sort of looks like a bird bath, but you wouldn't have a bird bath inside of a house. And it's not a fountain. There's no water device here. In fact, it won't even hold water. So you end up with a puzzle in several ways. And again, notice, like the hall stand, it's not functional. There's oftentimes a tremendous fascination in the 19th century with Greek or Greco-Roman, well, Neo-Greco-Roman art and stuff. And so what you very, very frequently, especially in this object, would have some sort of reference or make it look like it was somehow Greek, Roman, or such like that. And of course, both these objects do that. But Greeks and Romans didn't have these things. This is a card holder, and this would be set basically closer to the door than the hall stand. And this would be made of pewter or some other, brass or something like that. It had to be kept polished, so it had to be clean and tidy and shiny. And its function was again to hold the cards of people that had come to see you. So the function of the card holder was sort of an ancillary to the hall stand. And it was oftentimes used in sort of upwardly aspirational middle class homes, or especially middle class apartments in urban areas, because you wanted to sort of imply one that you were educated, so you know what the Greek and Roman imagery was. Secondly, was that you were so socially busy that you had so many people showing up that little cup holder thing on the side of the hall stand wouldn't work. So you needed a full-on card stand to handle the traffic in the terms of the number of the people who wanted to see you, PR with you, and then sort of socialize with you. Hey, here's some of the cards. So if you notice, they look sort of like business cards. They were generally slightly larger. Business cards are about 2/3 the size of this, but they're at the same time. In fact, this is where cardstock comes from. Cardstock doesn't come from business cards. Business cards are much later. Cardstock comes from this. Notice the incredibly complex calligraphy. Euro-American calligraphy, I think, in many ways, was probably driven by, in the late 19th century, was driven by this. A number of printing companies, including a lot of the ones here, like your Thrums, this was their mainstay of business, was cards. Business cards are a much smaller percentage. In fact, in this period, a lot of the time, you would have your name card. On the back, you would actually handwrite your business, with the idea that the personal relationship was more important than the business relationship. So the business cards are like the last almost appendix vestige, if you would, of this whole very important symbolic part of American life. Even if someone were there, you would give them your card and you expect their card back, very much like you see even today in Japanese society. And so these were a major part of American life. You had to have cards. They identified who you were. You would leave them if you went to someone's house and they weren't in. You would leave the card on the card, either the card part of the hall stand or else in the card, card tray, card stand itself. You would very frequently write, sorry I missed you, or you'd write some sort of a whole set of, if you go to the etiquette books, they've actually got a set of formulas you were supposed to use in terms of writing on these, in terms of what you wrote, where you wrote, even the color of ink that you used. And everyone knew this. This was part of American society. This wasn't part of just, one aspect. This was an American thing. And even if Americans didn't participate, if they were minorities or they didn't have enough money, they still understood all the messaging of this. These things were hugely important symbolically in American society. And there's a whole slew of things that Americans had around them that tied to this, not only the stands to hold the cards. You would have these very elegant trays that you would put cards in. One of the main reasons for clutch purses that women still use today was originally to hold cards, both your cards and the cards that people gave you. So a lot of what we think of as personal stuff, even in the 21st century, its original form, or at least in the 19th century, that form took this. So this, and all this occurred pretty much either outside, but most of this actually occurred in the hallway. And so the hallway and the furniture in the hallway were a huge part of this interaction in which people engaged in. And you have to remember that makes a lot of sense when you don't have digital, you don't have phones, you don't have any sort of, device by which you can, let people know you were there or something like that, except something like this. And throughout Europe and the United States, you found this. This is still something when you guys graduate, they'll say rights and something pertaining to. And one of the actual rights that you get by virtue of getting a degree is you would have something like this, and you would have down in the corner what your status was, that you had a BA degree in interior design or something, or a BFA in interior design, and that would be something that you put on these cards, and that was a very important part of that. Having a card that said you were a doctor, you wouldn't have the doctor up here necessarily, you'd have the doctor down here, and the doctor of what type of thing you were. So almost everything that you did in terms of your status and your position in society was defined, could be seen on the card. It could be seen on the calligraphy of the card, the quality of the card stock, all this. And again, if he goes back to the Sears catalogs, you'll even see they had all this stuff for sale. So this was a huge part of American life in the 19th, and in fact, into the early part of the 20th century. It disappears very quickly right around the time just before World War I. By the 1920s, it's pretty much entirely gone. So it was part of American society in a period of time when people's social interaction was very different than it was in the post-World War I period, where you still didn't have telephones or anything like that, pretty much, but you had changed the way that you interacted with other people.